His hands would not stop shaking. Not from fear, not from cold, from something worse, the particular kind of trembling that lives in a man's hands when he knows exactly what is coming and cannot do a single thing to stop it. Oliver Grant stood in the courtyard at Wellington Barracks at 5:40 in the morning, and the sky above London was the color of a bruise, and every bone in his body wanted to be somewhere else. He was 23 years old. He was about to begin the longest day of his life. The bearskin hat was pressed down onto his head by the corporal on duty, and it settled over his ears with a weight that never felt like it should belong to a person. Nearly a kilogram of Canadian black bear fur, shaped into something that looked more like a piece of architecture than a piece of clothing. The chin strap bit into the soft skin below his jaw. He did not adjust it. Adjusting it would mean admitting it was uncomfortable, and admitting it was uncomfortable would mean admitting that some part of him had not yet become the soldier he was supposed to be. His boots had been polished for 2 hours the night before, not by a machine, by his own hands, with a cloth and a tin and a patience he had taught himself, because the army does not wait for patience to arrive naturally in a young man. It builds it into him, layer by layer, the same way he had been building the mirror shine into those boots, until the leather reflected the ceiling of the barracks room back at him, and he could see the outline of his own face looking up from the floor. Oliver was from Coventry. He had grown up in a red-brick terraced house on a quiet street, where the biggest event of any given Tuesday was whether the delivery van would block Mrs. Patterson's driveway again. His father had worked in a parts factory for 31 years. His mother taught piano lessons in the front room every Thursday afternoon, and the scales drifted through the thin walls and into Oliver's bedroom, and he had fallen asleep to arpeggios more nights than he could count. There was nothing military about any of it. No uncles in uniform, no grandfather's medals in a drawer. No family story about service or sacrifice that he'd been handed like a torch and told to carry forward. He had walked into the recruitment office on a Wednesday in February, during the kind of gray drizzle that makes every decision feel more serious than it might otherwise, and he had signed his name, and that had been that. His mother had cried, his father had shaken his hand. His younger sister Claire, who was 15 and deeply unimpressed by most things, had looked up from her homework and said, "Don't get shot." It was, in its own way, the most affectionate thing she could have offered. Basic training had done what basic training is designed to do. It had taken the boy from Coventry who couldn't sit still through a full film without checking his phone, and it had rebuilt him into something more patient, more precise, and considerably more tired. He had learned to shine boots. He had learned to press creases into trousers so sharp they could have cut paper. He had learned to stand still for 10 minutes, then 20, then 40, then an hour, and he had learned that the mind, when the body is not permitted to move, becomes an extremely loud place. The selection for ceremonial duty had surprised him. It wasn't something he had asked for. There was no application, no interview. One morning his name appeared on a list, and a corporal told him he had steady hands and good height, and that was apparently enough. He reported for ceremonial training 3 weeks later and spent the following months learning how to be a piece of the palace. That is not a dramatic way of saying it. It is simply accurate. The guards at Buckingham Palace are, in a functional sense, part of the building. They stand where the gates are. They move on a schedule, as fixed as the hands of a clock. They do not react to the city that moves around them. Rain, sun, tourists, noise, the very ordinary chaos of London going about its day. None of it reaches them. They are there to hold a position, and they hold it, and in holding it, they become, for the duration of their shift, something closer to symbol than to person. Oliver had understood this intellectually, the way you can understand what cold water feels like without having been submerged in it. His first shift on post had taught him what understanding it actually meant. 4 hours. His first assignment had been 4 hours. He had managed 3 of them before the trembling started. Not his hands this time, but something deeper, some fundamental part of him that needed to scratch an itch that wasn't on his skin, that needed to roll his shoulders, that needed to take a single step sideways for no reason other than the desire to move. He had not taken the step. He had found, in the silence and the stillness, that the mind reaches for something to hold on to, and what his had reached for, in that first long afternoon, was the memory of a song his mother used to play. A simple thing, 4 bars that repeated, the kind of piece a beginner works through in their first month of lessons. He had played it in his head, note by note, and when it ended, he had started it again, and that small domestic piece of music had carried him through the last 40 minutes of that first post. He had said nothing about this to anyone. It felt private, in a way he could not entirely explain. It felt like something that was only his, not the uniform, not the position, not the polished boots, but this small, invisible trick, this inner room he had discovered when everything outside had been locked shut. 6 months later, he stood in the courtyard at 5:40 in the morning, about to take up a post that would last 6 hours. The longest shift he had ever been assigned. The shift had come down to him because 2 other guards had reported sick the previous evening, and Oliver had been on the rota for a shorter assignment, and the system had simply redistributed the time the way water redistributes itself when you move a wall. It fills the available space, indifferent to inconvenience. He had found out at 9 the previous evening. He had spent 20 minutes sitting on the edge of his bunk doing the arithmetic. 6 hours, 360 minutes. He was going to need more than 4 bars of a piano exercise. The corporal gave the order, and Oliver began to march. His boots struck the ground with a sound like a full stop. The palace was 20 minutes away, and the morning was cold enough to make the air taste of metal, and somewhere behind him London was beginning its day. Buses pulling out of depots, bread being loaded into ovens, people queuing for coffee in disposable cups, and all of it was a world away from the particular silence into which he was walking. The gates of Buckingham Palace appeared in front of him the way they always did, enormous, golden-tipped, absolutely certain of themselves. The tourist crowds were thin at this hour, a scattering of early risers and travelers with jet lag who had wandered down the mall in the pale morning light with cameras around their necks. By 8 the railings would be packed. By 10 it would be a wall of faces. Oliver marched to his position. He executed his turn. He came to a stop. The city moved around him. He did not move with it. The trembling in his hands was gone. Some mechanism in him, built over months of training and repetition, and those long evenings with the polished tin, had learned to read the uniform as a signal to the body. This is not the time for trembling. The hands went still. The spine straightened of its own accord. The chin lifted to exactly the angle it was supposed to be, and the bearskin settled its weight across the top of his skull, and Oliver Grant became, for the next 6 hours, the East Gate Guard. He could feel his own heartbeat. That was, oddly, the thing he always noticed first. In the noise of ordinary life, the heartbeat is lost under everything else. Conversation, traffic, the television in the next room, the private chatter of a mind that never quite stops. But here, inside the uniform, inside the stillness, his heartbeat was loud and steady and entirely present, and for a moment it was the only sound in the world. A pigeon landed 3 feet from his left boot and looked at him sideways, the way pigeons do, with that particular bird intelligence that seems to assess a situation entirely without sentiment. Oliver did not look at the pigeon. The pigeon, apparently satisfied, walked away. It was 6 minutes past 6 in the morning. He had 5 hours and 54 minutes left, and somewhere in the back of his mind, very quietly, like a projector starting up in an empty room, the opening notes of a film he had watched with his sister Claire began to play. He let them. The film was The Lion King. He had not chosen it deliberately. It had simply arrived, the way memories do when the mind is given no other occupation, not summoned but surfaced, rising up from some quiet place where it had been sitting for years, waiting for exactly this kind of emptiness to expand into. Claire had been 9 years old when she had seen it for the first time. Not in a cinema, but on a Saturday afternoon at home, Oliver 13, and sprawled across the sofa with a bowl of cereal, claiming to be watching something else entirely. He had watched every minute of it. He had not admitted this to Claire then. He was not sure he had admitted it to himself until this particular morning, standing at the east gate of Buckingham Palace, with his chin strap biting into his jaw, and a pigeon somewhere to his left, making considered inquiries about nothing in particular. The opening sequence began in his mind the way it always began, that wide, unhurried sunrise over the savannah, the deep horn note that rises before the first voices join it. Oliver could hear every instrument. His mother's piano lessons, the years of scales drifting through walls, had given him an ear for music that he had never done much with, had never cultivated or developed in any organized way, but which lived in him nonetheless, making the music in his memory more complete and more specific than it might otherwise have been. He heard the strings. He heard the drumbeat underneath. He heard the voices rise. A woman appeared at the railings. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, American by the sound of the one word she said to the man beside her. Incredible, spoken in that particular flat vowel that crosses state lines but not oceans. She had a camera with a very serious lens, the kind that costs more than Oliver's monthly wage and announces itself before you've even seen the face behind it. She raised it. The shutter clicked several times in rapid succession. Oliver stared through her in the direction of the middle distance, and the opening ceremony on the plains of Africa continued in perfect silence inside his skull. He was aware, in a remote and academic kind of way, that he was being photographed. This was not unusual. He was photographed approximately 40 times an hour on a busy day, by tourists from every country he could name, and several he probably couldn't. He existed, from their perspective, as a curiosity, as an element of the scenery, as proof that England was still England, whatever that meant to whoever was visiting. He was not offended by this. He had made his peace with being looked at the way one makes peace with any unchangeable condition. Not cheerfully exactly, but thoroughly. The woman lowered her camera and said something to the man beside her, and they both laughed, and Oliver did not hear what she said, because Mufasa was speaking to his son on a rocky ledge above the dawn-lit kingdom, and the weight of what was being said, about what we are called to be, occupied more of Oliver's attention than the woman with the camera. By 7 in the morning the crowds had thickened slightly. A school group arrived from somewhere, 40 children in yellow high-visibility jackets, shepherded by 3 teachers who had the particular look of people who had been on their feet since before their coffee was ready. The children pressed themselves against the railings. Several of them pointed at Oliver. One small boy, 6 or 7, turned to his teacher and said very clearly, "Is he real?" The teacher said he was real, and the boy looked back at Oliver with an expression that suggested he was reserving judgment. Oliver was, at this moment, watching Simba lose his father. It is a strange thing to experience grief, even fictional grief, even the memory of fictional grief from a Saturday afternoon 14 years past, while standing at absolute attention in full ceremonial dress in front of a crowd of strangers who are taking your photograph. Strange and oddly true. The film had made him cry the first time he watched it, and he had denied this vigorously to Claire for years, and standing now with the memory of it unspooling note by note through his mind, he felt something that was not quite sadness and not quite warmth but partway between both, a feeling that did not have a name that he knew of. He let it sit. He had nowhere else to put it. At 7:45, a man in a bright green jacket stopped directly in front of Oliver and stood there for what Oliver's internal clock estimated to be approximately 8 minutes. The man had a child on his shoulders, a girl of perhaps 3, who was gripping his hair with both hands and staring down at Oliver from her elevated position with the absolute solemnity of very small children who are trying to understand something they do not yet have the vocabulary for. Oliver met her gaze without expression. She did not look away. He did not look away. They regarded each other, the 3-year-old and the soldier, across the iron railing and the distance between their worlds, for nearly 2 full minutes. Then the man shifted his weight, adjusted the child, and they moved on. Oliver was well into the second half of the film by now, rationing it more carefully, drawing out scenes he remembered well, lingering in the music. He was aware, and this awareness was itself a part of the discipline he had developed, of how long the film would last, and how much time remained on his shift, and the mathematics of the two. The Lion King runs 88 minutes. He had nearly 5 hours remaining. He would need other films. He had been preparing for this. He had given the matter genuine thought the previous evening, sitting on the edge of his bunk after the arithmetic. 6 hours was long. 6 hours required planning. He had gone through his mental library in order of length and clarity. Films he knew well enough to replay in detail, not just the outline but the actual scenes, the actual music, the actual words. Claire had always watched things repeatedly, obsessively, until she could quote them in her sleep. Oliver had absorbed this by proximity. He had sat through more films more times than he had ever chosen to sit through them, and all of that involuntary viewing had laid down in him a library he had never catalogued until now. He had made a mental list: The Lion King, Grease, which Claire had watched so many times that Oliver knew every word of every song despite a complete absence of personal desire to know them, Titanic, which she had put on 2 weekends in a row and which Oliver had complained about so enthusiastically that the complaining itself had become a kind of attention, Finding Nemo. He was less certain about Finding Nemo. Some of the middle section was unclear, but it would do for a half-hour block if needed. And then there were the half-memories, the fragments, the scenes from films he had caught on television or watched with friends, which could be reassembled into something that lasted even if the accuracy was approximate. He had gone to sleep feeling, if not prepared, then at least armed. A bus stopped on the road behind the crowd. A new wave of tourists poured off it with the energetic purposefulness of people who have 40 minutes at each stop and intend to use them. Cameras appeared. Phones appeared. A man held his phone sideways and narrated something quietly into it, pointing at Oliver, which Oliver noted with the peripheral awareness that is the closest thing to observation available to a ceremonial guard on post. The Lion King ended. It ended the way it always ended, with the sunrise, with the circle, with everything returned to what it was supposed to be, restored, and forward-moving, hope dressed as repetition. Oliver held the last note of the closing music in his head for a long moment. Then he let it go. He had 4 hours and 11 minutes remaining. Grease began. It began as it always begins, with the animated opening, which Oliver rendered from memory with the fidelity of a man who had been subjected to it approximately 26 times across one summer when Claire was 13 and had decided that this particular film was the defining work of human art. He knew the title song. He knew Summer Nights. He knew the words to You're the One That I Want, and he had always considered this knowledge to be one of the least useful things stored in his mind. And standing at the east gate of Buckingham Palace in ceremonial dress, reconstructing the hand-jive scene note by note in his memory, he revised this view entirely. The knowledge was, in this specific and unlikely context, absolutely essential. Something else was happening too, something he had not anticipated when he was doing his arithmetic on the edge of the bunk the previous evening. The films were not merely filling time. They were doing something more interesting than that. Inside the stillness of his body, inside the complete enforced silence of the post, the stories were playing with an intensity he had never quite managed on a sofa. There were no distractions. There was no phone in his hand. There was no one beside him making comments. There was only the story, and his memory of it, and the space inside his skull that had nothing else to occupy itself with. He understood things in these replays that he had missed in the watching. The way a scene built, the way a piece of music told you what to feel before a single word was spoken. The way a good story held two things at once, what was happening on the surface and what was actually happening underneath, and trusted the audience to feel both without being told to. He was, he realized, watching more carefully now than he had ever watched anything. A child pressed his face against the railing directly in front of Oliver and made a noise that Oliver, in his peripheral awareness, registered as a very deliberate attempt to provoke a reaction. Oliver did not react. The child made the noise again, louder. Oliver watched Sandy realize something important about herself in the final scene of Grease, and the child, finding no purchase in this absolute stillness, eventually wandered away. Oliver brought his whole attention back to the music. He had 3 hours and 49 minutes remaining. He was starting to understand something he would not have words for until much later, that the silence outside and the sound inside had become a single thing, and that the single thing was not loneliness as he might have expected, but something closer to its opposite. He would not know what to call it then. He would not know what to call it now, standing with his spine straight and his hands still, and the morning light moving across the golden tips of the palace gate, the shadows shortening as the sun climbed, London proceeding entirely without him. He only knew that he was, improbably, completely, and in a way he had never been in an ordinary moment of an ordinary day, exactly where he was. The woman arrived at 9:17. Oliver did not know the exact time. He had no watch, there was nothing on post he could consult, but he had developed, through months of shifts, an interior clock accurate to within roughly 5 minutes, and 9:17 was what it told him when she appeared at the railings with a piece of card in her hand. The card was white, written on it in thick black letters, in handwriting that suggested some effort had been made, were the words, "Please blink." She held it up with both hands. She was in her 30s, with short red hair, and a scarf the color of something Oliver's mother would have called mustard, and Oliver himself would have struggled to name more specifically. She was grinning. Not the grin of someone trying to be cruel, not mockery or contempt, but genuine delight in the attempt, the kind of grin that belongs to a person who has thought of a small joke and cannot quite contain their own pleasure in it. Oliver did not blink. This was not because he was suppressing the urge. He simply did not register her sign as a reason to blink, in the same way that a professional swimmer does not register the sound of children splashing in the shallow end as a reason to change their stroke. His eyes moved, as they always moved, on their slow, methodical track across the scene. Crowd, gate, road, crowd. And the woman with the sign was simply part of the scene, noted and passed over, like the pigeon that had inspected his left boot at dawn, and the bus that had disgorged its tourists, and the child who had made the noise. The woman waited. She had clearly anticipated that there might be a delay in his response to her invitation to blink. Oliver completed his visual sweep and returned to the middle distance. She lowered the sign slightly, adjusted her expectations, and then, with the determination of someone who has committed to a bit and intends to see it through, held it up again at a slightly different angle. Oliver, at this precise moment, was watching Rose step onto the prow of the Titanic. He had moved on from Greece approximately 37 minutes earlier, after allowing himself to linger in the final scene longer than was strictly necessary, running through every note of the closing number with the careful attention of a person who is conserving a resource they have decided they cannot afford to waste. Greece had bought him time. It had bought him 110 minutes. Combined with the Lion King's 88, he had cleared 3 hours and 18 minutes of his shift without touching his reserves. Titanic ran 3 hours and 14 minutes. He was aware of this because Claire had once announced it during the second of the 2 consecutive weekend viewings, as a kind of preemptive defense against the complaint she knew was coming from Oliver. 3 hours and 14 minutes, she had said. It is a classic. Classics are allowed to be long. Oliver had said nothing, but he had looked at the television with an expression that communicated a complete lack of enthusiasm, and then he had watched every minute of it, and then the second weekend had come, and he had watched it again, and somewhere in the middle of the second viewing he had stopped resisting the film, and the film had got into him. Now he was grateful for every single one of its 194 minutes. He reconstructed it with care. He was methodical about it. He began at the beginning, the modern-day framing, the submersible descending into the dark, the wreckage appearing on the monitor. He gave himself over to the slow build of it. He did not skip ahead to the parts he remembered most clearly. He held the pace. Patience, the army had built into him, and he used it here the way he was using it in his legs and his back and his arms. Quietly, without fanfare, without complaint. The woman with the sign was still there. A man standing next to her had noticed what she was doing, and was now watching with interest, waiting to see if anything happened. Nothing happened. Oliver's face remained exactly as it had been at 6 minutes past 6. The man said something to the woman. She said something back. They both looked at Oliver. Oliver watched Jack Dawson climb aboard a ship he had won the ticket for in a card game. At some point, Oliver judged it to be around 9:45. The woman accepted that the sign was not going to produce results, and folded it in half and tucked it under her arm and walked away. As she left, she glanced back at Oliver once, and there was something in the glance that was not defeat exactly, but something adjacent to it, a respectful acknowledgement that she had tried and he had held. She disappeared into the crowd. Oliver felt nothing about this. He was watching a dinner party in a first-class dining room on a ship that would not reach its destination. By 10 o'clock, the crowds at the railings were 3 and 4 deep. This was the thickest part of the tourist day. Families who had walked down from their hotels after breakfast, school groups that had been deposited from coaches, couples with matching jackets who appeared to have an itinerary. The noise level increased. Oliver was aware of it the way you are aware of weather. He registered it without turning toward it, without giving it more attention than its function in his peripheral awareness required. A tall man positioned himself directly in front of Oliver and began what was clearly an instructional commentary for the woman beside him, who held a phone at eye level and was filming. The tall man gestured toward Oliver with the authority of someone who had read something about this on the internet. He explained, incorrectly, Oliver noted, the precise rules about when a guard is and is not permitted to speak, and then he explained, also incorrectly, the purpose of the bearskin hat. Oliver heard this with the same equanimity with which he heard everything on post. He was not bothered by the errors. He was not tempted to correct them. He was watching the iceberg. It is, he had always thought, the iceberg scene that the whole film hinges on. Not the sinking, not the romance, not the arguments about wealth and class and freedom, but the moment the ship and the ice find each other in the dark, the inevitability of it. The way all of those specific, individual lives had gathered in that specific place at that specific moment, and the ice was already there, had always been there, moving through the dark on its own vast and indifferent course, and the collision was not an accident so much as a convergence. He had not thought about it this carefully when he watched it on Claire's sofa. He was thinking about it now. There was something about this particular kind of stillness, the mandated, enforced, absolute stillness of the post, that stripped away the surface of everything and left only what was actually underneath. He had noticed this before, on shorter shifts, but never with this intensity, never with this clarity. The films he was replaying were not the same films he had watched on a sofa with a bowl of cereal. They were the same scenes, the same music, the same words, but the quality of attention he was bringing to them was entirely different, and different attention, he was discovering, produced a different experience of the same material. He realized, more awake right now than he was in almost any other moment of his ordinary life. The irony of this was not lost on him. He was standing completely still, performing, from the outside, the closest approximation to absence that a living person can manage, and inside, he was more present than he had been in years. A group of teenagers arrived at the railing to his left. They were 14 or 15, boys and girls in the specific configuration of a school trip, where the teacher's authority has been slightly diluted by the open air and the distance from the classroom. One of them, a boy with very bright trainers and the loose-limbed confidence of someone who has recently discovered that other people find him funny, turned to his friends and announced that he was going to make the guard laugh. He approached the railing. He made a face. Then another face. Then a third face that was considerably more ambitious than the first two. Oliver was watching a man named Cal Hockley throw a diamond necklace across a first-class stateroom in a fit of wealthy rage, and it was precisely as theatrical and hollow as it had always seemed. The boy with the bright trainers ran through several more expressions. His friends were laughing, and the laughter encouraged him, and he escalated. He narrated his own attempts in a stage whisper for the benefit of his audience. Still nothing from Oliver. Oliver had gone somewhere that the boys' faces couldn't follow. It was not coldness, it was not contempt, it was more like the way a man who is very deeply asleep cannot hear a door closing in another room, not refusal to respond, but simple and complete absence from the frequency at which the response would have been required. The boy made one final, spectacular face, something that involved an impressive number of simultaneously deployed muscles, and then gave up, and turned back to his friends, and they moved on down the railing with their laughter, and their bright trainers, and their afternoon. Oliver watched the Titanic begin its descent. He was aware of the discomfort in his legs at this point, not pain, not a crisis, but the deep, patient ache of muscles that have been held in position for a long time and are making their situation known. He directed his attention to the ache, the way he directed his attention to everything else on post, acknowledged, registered, filed, moved past. The ache was not a problem. The ache was simply information. The information was that his body was doing its job, and the job was continuing, and the ache would either stay or it wouldn't, and either way the shift would end at the time it was scheduled to end, and not a moment before. By 11 o'clock the bearskin hat had been on his head for 5 hours. He became aware of this as something distinct from the general awareness he maintained of time passing. 5 hours. It had a particular quality, 5 hours in a bearskin hat, not like 4 hours, which was long but had a kind of normality to it, a familiarity. 5 hours entered a different territory. The weight of the hat was no longer simply weight. It was its own presence, something he was in relationship with, in the way you are in relationship with a very persistent piece of weather, something that had been there long enough that ignoring it required its own specific effort. He breathed through it. There was a technique he had developed, not taught to him, not named, simply built over months of practice, which was less a technique than a reorientation. Instead of holding the discomfort at a distance, pretending it wasn't there, he would let it be there, fully and without argument. The hat was heavy, his legs were carrying him, his back held its position. All of this was true, and he let it be true, and the truth of it, once admitted fully, became somehow easier to live inside. The ship went down. He played the ending of the film with the care of someone laying something valuable in a very specific place. He stayed with the music. He stayed with the final scenes. He gave the film the ending it deserved, not rushing through it the way he might have rushed through anything on a sofa with somewhere else to be. When the last note of the closing music faded, he let the silence that followed be exactly as long as it needed to be. Then he opened the door of the next room. He had approximately 2 hours remaining. His reserves were in good shape. He had planned for this point in the shift. He knew where he was going next. Not another complete film, but something different. Something he had saved specifically for this part of the day, when the mind was still sharp, but the body was beginning to remind him of itself. He began to construct, from memory, a film that he and Claire had watched every Christmas for as long as he could remember. The specific kind of film that lives in childhood as much as on a screen, that is inseparable from a particular smell, a particular time of year, a particular version of yourself that no longer exists but can still be found in the right memory. His mother had made tea in red mugs. His father had been in his usual chair. Claire had been on the floor with her legs folded, 3 feet from the screen, refusing to move further back no matter who suggested it. The room had been warm in the specific way that rooms are warm at Christmas, a warmth that includes more than temperature. Oliver held this. He held it inside the stillness and the cold and the weight of the hat and the accumulated hours of the post. He let the memory be exactly what it was, small, domestic, irreplaceable. He stood absolutely still. The crowd moved in front of him. He was somewhere much quieter than any of them could see. The film stopped working at 11:42. He knew it was 11:42 because there was a clock on a building he could see without moving his head, a large clock that he had been peripherally aware of since the beginning of his shift, reading it in the same casual way he read everything around him, registered, filed, not dwelt upon. 11:42. He was halfway through a half-remembered Christmas film, reconstructing a scene from fragments, and the fragments stopped connecting. It was not a dramatic failure. There was no moment of panic, no sudden blankness. It was more gradual than that, like a radio signal that begins to drift, the music still there but thickening with static, the words becoming less clear, the sequence of events softening at the edges. He had been pulling the Christmas film from a memory that was warm but not precise, assembling it from impressions rather than accurate recall, and now the impressions were running thin and the assembly was breaking down. He tried to redirect. He pulled up another scene, another film, half a memory of something he and his friend Pete had watched on a phone on a train somewhere, the quality too low to have laid down clean images, just the shape of what had happened without the detail. He reached for Finding Nemo, the half-remembered film he had kept in reserve, and he found that the middle section, the stretch he had been uncertain about the previous evening, was less certain now than it had been then, worn thinner by the time he had already spent drawing on memory. He let it go. For the first time in 5 hours and 36 minutes, Oliver Grant stood at the east gate of Buckingham Palace, with nothing playing inside his head. What happened next was not what he expected. He had imagined, when he thought about it the night before, that this would be the dangerous part, the part where the shift became genuinely difficult. He had imagined restlessness, the urge to move climbing back up his legs, the mind casting around for purchase the way a climber casts for the next handhold. He had imagined something like dread. What he found instead was quiet, not the absence of noise. The crowd was still present, still moving, still generating its steady ambient murmur. But inside him, where the films had been running, where the music had been playing, there was now simply space. A large, still room with nothing in it. He had expected the emptiness to feel like shortage. Instead it felt like he could not find the word for it, like arriving somewhere you had not known you were going. He breathed. He had always breathed on post, obviously. The body insists on it regardless of instructions. But he had never breathed with this quality of attention, had never noticed the breath arriving and the breath leaving with this particular clarity. The air was cold and tasted faintly of the city, exhaust and bread and something green from the park, and it moved into him and out of him, and the movement of it was, in this specific moment, interesting. This was the word that occurred to him. Not important, not profound, just interesting. A boy was standing at the railing. Oliver had noticed him before. This particular boy, because he had been there for a long time. Not continuously, but he kept returning, which Oliver had tracked in the peripheral way he tracked everything. He was perhaps 5 years old, with very serious brown eyes and a winter coat that had something embroidered on the front pocket, though Oliver could not make out what. He was not laughing, he was not performing for his parents. He was simply standing at the railing and looking at Oliver with the entire, focused, unself-conscious attention that very small children sometimes bring to things that confuse them. The boy had the quality of someone trying to solve a puzzle. His expression was not one of delight or amusement, but of genuine concentration, the kind that appears on a small face when something does not quite fit the categories they have so far assembled for how the world works. Oliver looked back at him. This was not unusual. Oliver's eyes moved across the scene in their regular pattern, and the boy was part of the scene. But this time, when his gaze arrived at the boy, something in the quality of his looking was different. The films were gone. There was space. And the boy was there, looking with that complete and serious attention, and Oliver received it. For approximately 90 seconds, the two of them regarded each other across the iron railing. The boy did not wave. He did not smile. He did not look at his parents for a response or a cue. He simply looked, with those serious brown eyes, at the man in the bearskin hat who stood completely still while the rest of the city moved, and whatever he was trying to understand about this seemed, for the duration of those 90 seconds, to be the most important thing in his immediate world. Oliver could not have told anyone what he felt during this. He was not sure feeling was quite the right word. He was aware of the boy the way he was aware of the weight of the hat, and the ache in his legs, and the taste of the city air. Present, specific, real in a way that went deeper than thought. Then the boy's father said something from behind, and the boy turned, and the moment was over, and the crowd closed around them, and they were gone. Oliver's eyes completed their sweep and came back to the middle distance. He stood with the quiet. It was, he was discovering, A very different thing from the boredom he had expected. He had used the films to avoid the quiet, had filled it deliberately and with a kind of structured purpose, and the films had served him well, had carried him through 5.5 hours with their music and their stories and their particular kind of interior noise. But now the films were finished, and the quiet was here, and it was not the enemy he had been expecting. It was more like a room he had never been allowed into before. The bearskin hat pressed down on his skull. He let it press. The ache moved through his legs and his lower back, and he let it move. A gust of wind came off the park and pushed against him, and he let it push, and none of these things asked anything of him except to be still, and he was still, and the being still was not, in this moment, a performance or an endurance. It simply was. A woman with 2 shopping bags walked past on the pavement behind the crowd. She was walking quickly, with the particular pace of someone who has somewhere to be and is already behind on being there. She did not look at the palace. She did not look at Oliver. She looked straight ahead, phone pressed to her ear, one bag bumping against her knee with each step, and then she was past and gone, and her footsteps faded into the general sound of the city, and the city absorbed her and continued. Oliver found this interesting too. He found, in fact, that without the films, without the music, without the structure he had built to carry himself through the day, every individual thing that entered his awareness was interesting. The way the light had moved since morning, the shadows shortened and then stretched in the other direction as the sun climbed and started to fall. The way the crowd changed character at different times of day, thicker and louder at 10, slightly thinner and quieter by midday, a different demographic present at each hour. The way the buildings around him were very still as he was, but differently still. They were still because they had never moved, and he was still because he had decided not to. This distinction felt, in the quiet, worth noticing. His friend Pete, who had left the army 2 years earlier to work for his uncle's plumbing business in Bristol, had always said that Oliver thought too much. Pete meant this kindly, in the way that people from Bristol say most things. He said it with a grin, but he had meant it. Oliver, Pete said, was always somewhere else in his head, always processing something that had already happened, or rehearsing something that had not happened yet, never quite fully in the room he was actually in. Standing at the gate in the silence and the cold, Oliver thought about this. Pete was probably right, and it was, he supposed, useful in this particular situation. The capacity to be elsewhere in his head had kept him going for 5.5 hours. But the last 20 minutes had shown him something different. The elsewhere had run out, and the here was not only sufficient, but in some way he could not articulate more vivid than the elsewhere had been, more specific, more real. He was cold. He was physically tired in a way that existed underneath the training-built steadiness, a deep tiredness of the kind that comes not from exertion but from prolonged stillness, from muscles asked to hold rather than move. He was aware of every part of his body with a precision he could not normally access. His feet inside his boots, pressed flat against the ground, carrying the whole of him. His spine, straight by discipline, and now straight because it had forgotten how to be otherwise. His hands, loose at his sides, the trembling from this morning entirely resolved, entirely gone. His hands were very still. He thought about the morning, about standing in the courtyard with the sky the color of a bruise, and his hands not steady. He had come a long way from that in 6 hours, without moving more than 20 feet. Something had happened inside all that stillness, something he could not have named in advance or planned for, something the films had helped to carry him toward, and then deposited him at the edge of, and then left him to find on his own. The clock on the building said 14:17, 3 minutes. He had 3 minutes remaining on the longest shift he had ever served. He did not count them. He did not watch the clock. He stood and he breathed, and the quiet was around him and inside him, and it was the same quiet, the same continuous unbroken thing, and the city moved, and the light moved, and the crowd moved, and he did not. He was, he thought, just before the thought dissolved into the breathing, absolutely here. And then he heard boots on the road behind him, the crisp, specific sound of ceremonial footsteps, and he knew without turning that his replacement had arrived. The handover took 11 seconds. He counted them, afterward, without having intended to. A habit from training, the way some habits are, so thoroughly installed that they operate without instruction. 6 words exchanged between Oliver and the guard who replaced him, words so established by repetition and protocol that they existed less as language than as a kind of key, a signal that one thing had ended and another had begun. And then the new guard was at the position, and Oliver had taken 3 steps left, executed his turn, and was walking. He was walking. The sensation of forward movement after 6 hours of stillness is not subtle. It announces itself in every part of the body simultaneously, a kind of quiet shock of permission, as if the muscles need a moment to believe that they have been given leave to do this again. His legs took their first steps with a stiffness that was not pain but the record of all those hours, a physical history of the shift written in tissue and tendon. He breathed out fully, a breath that had been partial for 6 hours, and the air that left him was warm against the cold afternoon. He did not look back. There was no reason to look back. The gate was covered. The new guard was at the position. The post continued. It did not need Oliver anymore, had already absorbed his replacement with the smooth indifference of something very old and very practiced. He walked away from the palace with the same unhurried, measured pace that ceremonial duty required even in transit, the bearskin hat still on his head, the chin strap still fastened, and the afternoon light of mid-February falling across the mall at an angle that made the gravel glow a pale amber. Tourists watched him go. There is always a particular quality to the way people watch a ceremonial guard moving. When the guard is at post, the watching has a kind of active optimism to it, the hope that something will happen, that the figure will react, that the stillness will break in some interesting way. When the guard is in transit, returning from post, the watching is different, more respectful perhaps, or simply less focused, the entertainment value of the situation having diminished. People still looked. They always looked, but they looked the way you look at something that is completing rather than something that is building. Oliver had no awareness of being watched. He was not entirely sure he was aware of very much at all in those first few minutes of walking. Something in him had gone very quiet, not in the interior quiet way of the last 20 minutes at the gate, but in the aftermath quiet way of something that has been intensely concentrated and has now released. He walked, and the city made its sounds, and the gravel was cold under his boots, and none of it required anything from him, and this was, in its way, the most extraordinary thing. He had not realized how much a thing can require of you, until the requiring stops. The barracks appeared. He crossed the courtyard, the familiar sounds of the buildings around him, voices from somewhere inside, the distant percussion of equipment being moved, the specific institutional noise of a military establishment going about its afternoon, came in around the edges of his quiet, and he let them come. In the changing room he removed the bearskin hat and set it on its stand. He sat with it for a moment, not sentimentally, not with any grand feeling about what had passed. He simply sat with it the way you sit with something that has been in contact with you for a very long time and has thereby acquired a kind of significance, the way a well-worn object acquires significance not through beauty or cost, but through duration. The hat had been on his head for 6 hours and 2 minutes. It had pressed into his skull and bent his ears and collected the heat of his body, and he had carried it, and it had carried him, in its way, and now the hat was back on its stand, and he was back in the room, and the day was resuming its ordinary shape. He reached up and touched the top of his head. The absence of the hat was, briefly, as present as the hat had been. A peculiar lightness. He had not expected this. He had expected relief, and he felt relief, but underneath the relief was this other thing, a kind of echo, the ghost of pressure in a place the pressure no longer was. He had a shower. The shower was, after 6 hours on post, a thing of significant beauty. The water was very hot, and he stood in it for longer than was strictly necessary, and did not think about anything in particular, and let the heat come in through his shoulders and his back, and reach into the accumulated stiffness of the day, and he breathed steam, and was, for 7 minutes, entirely without obligation or history or any interior noise at all. When he came out, his colleague Danny was pulling on a sweatshirt in front of the lockers. Danny was 25, from somewhere in Yorkshire, with the particular Yorkshire quality of saying exactly as many words as a situation required and not one more. He had been on a shorter post that morning and had been back for 2 hours and was in the cheerful, restored state of a man who has had lunch and a rest and the pleasurable distance of time between himself and the thing he had been doing. Danny looked at Oliver. Oliver was drying his hair with a towel. "Long one?" Danny said. 6 hours, Oliver said. Danny made a sound that acknowledged this without elaborating. He understood 6 hours without Oliver having to explain it, the way you understand a thing when you have experienced a version of it yourself. He did not ask for more detail. He did not offer sympathy. He offered acknowledgement, which was, in the currency of their particular environment, considerably more valuable. "There's pasta left," Danny said. Oliver said he would be there in 5 minutes. He sat on the bench in front of his locker and looked at his boots. They were still polished, 6 hours on post, and they had retained most of the mirror shine. The soles were dirty, cobblestone and grit, but the uppers were largely as he had left them, the leather still reflecting a pale approximation of the ceiling above him. He had put 2 hours into those boots the previous evening. He would need to put another hour into them tonight. This was simply the condition of the job. He noted it without complaint. He got dressed. He walked to the mess hall and got a plate of pasta and sat down and ate. The pasta was, objectively, very ordinary pasta. It had been sitting in a container for some time and had the slightly softened quality of food that is weighted. He ate all of it. It was, in that particular moment, one of the better meals he could remember eating, not because of the pasta's quality, but because of his own hunger, the specific, honest hunger of a body that has been working all day without any opportunity to do anything about it. He ate, and the mess hall had its usual noise around him: conversation, the scrape of chairs, someone's phone playing something, and he sat inside it the way he had sat inside the crowd at the gate, present but contained, aware of it all without being consumed by it. He thought about the boy with the serious brown eyes. He thought about the woman with the please blink sign, and the grin she'd had when she made it, the genuine pleasure she'd taken in the attempt. He thought about the small girl in her father's arms who had watched him from above with solemn concentration, and the teenager with the bright trainers who had run through every expression in his repertoire, trying to break through something that was, by that point, not something Oliver was doing, but something he had become. He thought about the moment the films ran out. He turned this over in his mind the way you turn over a coin, looking at both sides without deciding which one matters more. The films had been useful. They had been, in the truest sense, exactly what they needed to be: a resource, an inner theater, a private library he had built up accidentally over years of being Claire's captive audience, and then drawn on in the most unlikely of circumstances. He felt something he recognized as gratitude, though it was directed at no one in particular. At Claire, perhaps distantly, at his mother's piano lessons, at the accumulated Saturdays and Christmas afternoons that had stocked the library without him knowing it was being stocked. But the quiet at the end had not been less than the films. It had been different, and in its difference it had been, he returned to the word, the only word he had, interesting. He finished his pasta. He sat for another few minutes. The mess hall thinned around him as people drifted back to their various afternoons. Danny passed behind him at some point with a mug of something, said nothing, which was fine. Oliver sat and the room was ordinary and warm, and he was in it. That evening he called Claire. It was 7:30. She answered on the third ring with the particular inflection of someone who has been in the middle of something and is giving you the portion of their attention that can spare itself, which in Claire's case was usually enough. She was in her second year of a degree in graphic design at a university in Manchester and had the specific busyness of someone who has recently discovered that being busy can also be enjoyable. "What?" she said, not rudely, just efficiently. "Titanic," Oliver said. A pause. What about it? You were right about it. Another pause, longer this time. He could hear her recalibrating, deciding whether this required the portion of her attention that couldn't spare itself. I have literally been telling you this since I was 14, she said. What's brought this on? I watched it today. You watched Titanic today. In my head, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Oliver, I love you, but sometimes you say things and I don't have any idea what to do with them. He smiled. He was sitting on the edge of his bunk, elbows on knees, and the barracks room was quiet around him, the last light going out of the small high window, and he was very tired in a way that was not unpleasant, a tiredness that felt earned and proportionate, a tiredness that knew exactly what it had come from. I was on a 6-hour post, he said. 6 hours, she repeated, the recalibration in her voice again. She was doing the arithmetic the same way he had done it on the bunk the previous evening, measuring the time against what she knew of what he did, which was not a great deal, but was enough for her to understand the scale of it. Without moving? Without moving. How did you? She stopped. The films, she said. The films, he said. He heard her absorb this. He could picture her on the other end, cross-legged on a desk chair probably, in her flat in Manchester, something open on a screen behind her, the particular Claire posture of a person folded comfortably into a small space. He had not seen her in 4 months. He would see her at Easter, if the rotas allowed. She was the same person who had been on the floor 3 feet from the screen watching lions and oceans and a ship going under, and she was an entirely different person, and both of these things were true at once. Which ones? She asked. The Lion King first, he said, then Greece. She made a sound of recognition, acknowledging these as reasonable choices, as though she had always known this was what they were for, not just entertainment, not just the thing you put on when you are 13 and have decided it is a classic, but provisions, stored against the possibility of a future where you might need them. And then Titanic, she said. And then Titanic. 3 hours and 14 minutes, she said, as she had said it once, years ago, on a sofa, as a preemptive defense. I know, he said. She laughed. It was the particular laugh she reserved for situations that did not require explanation, that existed between them in the place where things do not need to be spelled out, because the people involved already know. Oliver had not heard that laugh in 4 months, and it was, in that moment, the best sound he had heard all day. They talked for 22 minutes. Not about the shift, not about any of the things Oliver had been inside during the day, the quiet, the boy, the moment the films gave out. Those things were not yet ready to be talked about, not because they were painful, but because they were still too close, still too much themselves, and putting them into words felt like doing something irreversible to them. He would talk about them eventually, maybe to Claire, maybe to no one. Some things lived better as experience than as story. He had learned this, perhaps, from the films. The stories that stayed with you were not the ones you explained. They were the ones that happened in you somewhere, in the place below words, and left something behind that you did not immediately know the name of. He said good night. She said to drink some water. He said he would. He put his phone down and lay back on his bunk and looked at the ceiling. His boots were by the door, waiting. He would need to work on them before bed. An hour, maybe a little less if he was efficient. He would do it properly, the cloth, the tin, the patient circular motion, and the boots would be ready, and his hands would have something to do, and the day would move slowly into whatever came next. He was not in a hurry. He was the least in a hurry he had been in years. He reached up and touched the top of his head one more time, where the hat had been. The lightness was still there. The ghost of all that weight, still making itself known in the absence of the thing that caused it. He rested his hand on the top of his skull for a moment, feeling the warmth of it, the realness of it, the very ordinary and completely irreplaceable fact of it. He breathed. He closed his eyes. Outside the barracks window, London was already arranging itself for the next day, the city's enormous and indifferent machinery, resetting, reconfiguring, continuing. The tourists had gone back to their hotels. The school groups were on their coaches. The woman with the please blink sign was somewhere having dinner, probably telling the story to whoever she was with. The soldier who would not blink, the strange still figure at the gate, who had seemed to be somewhere else entirely. She was not wrong. He had been somewhere else entirely. And also, improbably, exactly where he was. The boots by the door waited with the patience of objects that understand waiting. Oliver lay on his bunk, and the room was quiet, and the city outside was the city outside, and Claire was in Manchester with her screen and her desk chair and her laugh, and the hat was on its stand, and the bearskin carried no trace of what had played inside the skull beneath it, no record of lions or ships or dancing or 3 hours and 14 minutes of ice and ocean. But Oliver carried it. All of it, every note and word and scene, laid down in the same quiet library that had received them, waiting with the same patient readiness for whatever long silence might come next. He slept.